Hey, comrades, I would like to introduce you to Professor Bruno Drwęski. You can find several dozen Bruno's lectures on revolutionary movements around the world on our Polish language channel. It is worth mentioning that Bruno is not only an academic lecturer, but also a political activist, and he owes his knowledge of the international communist movement to his activity in the board of the Communist Party of France, where he was responsible for international relations. Today we are starting a series of lectures in English, and the topic of today's lecture will be Bruno's latest book on Solidarność. It should be emphasized that the Solidarity movement has left a huge mark on Polish society in the last 40 years. Activists of the former Solidarity and anti-communist opposition still play a key role in Polish politics, and Polish society has become more and more clericalized ever since. It's important to mention also that Professor Bruno book is very critical of Solidarity, and that as soon as it was published in Poland, Polish society woke up, went out to the streets and a massive strike and shouted, "Get the fuck out!" in front of the churches. We are recording this lecture while there are ongoing protests in Poland, and I would like to ask you, what do you think about these protests?
I think that basically there is a new generation emerging in Poland that is completely fed up with the last 30-year discourse based on, of course, the so-called church and Catholic legitimacy, but also on the legitimacy of the Solidarność or Solidarity trade union, and on the legitimacy of all the myth about anti-communism. All this was mixed. Anti-communism, Solidarity trade union, so-called trade union, and church and national solidarity were the basis of the transformation that was carried on in the 90s. And the first generation was just only deceived by the result. But now we have a new generation that is not only deceived, but that is fed up with this discourse. And I think that my book just, it happened that it arrived at the good moment. It was not planned. It just happened at the good moment when a new generation doesn't want anymore to hear all this fantasy about the working class fighting for capitalism, fighting against socialism, fighting for national sovereignty under the church, and all this contradiction appeared. And that's the basic reason why you have manifestation here now in Poland, because this huge manifestation is not a massive manifestation that are aimed to create a new order, because for the moment there is no real opposition in Poland as a mass opposition, but there is a generation fed up. They are fed up with the liberal discourse, and they are fed up with the so-called national Catholic discourse, and with all this anti-communism. And also the Russophobic, because Russophobia is also part of this discourse.
So now let's move on the topic of your book. The Solidarity movement is portrayed by Western anti-communist propaganda as a workers' revolt against socialism, whose aim was to restore capitalism in Poland. Could you explain to our foreign viewers what Polish workers were fighting for? Did they want capitalism? Did they want unemployment? Did they want to privatize and close the factories they have been working in?
Of course not. This book was first published in France and then in Poland. If you want to see the Polish edition, it is that. And of course, that was, I would say that the working class movement of the summer 1980 was kidnapped after by the elite and the bourgeois elite and the anti-communist elite. At the beginning of the movement, we have to take into account that the condition of the working class was worst at the end of the 70s because Polish leadership made to Western banks, and they imported, in fact, to Poland the crisis of capitalism. And this led Polish working class to a miscontent. But this miscontent was not against socialism, because when the propaganda is showing the strike at the summer 1980, they always show the portrait of the Pope John Paul II. The second, but they never show the leaflets that was on the top of the striking shipyards, which was written socialism yes, deformation no. It means this movement was aimed to develop socialism. It was not against socialism. And if you read the first petitions from the workers, they are all linked with socialist basic rights, like, for example, more free days for women after giving birth, more holidays, better wages, better working control over economic policies, and so on and so on. So maybe we can say that these striking workers were naive, but we cannot say they were anti-communist. Maybe, of course, some of them were Catholic, but they were not Catholic in the sense of a new clerical state. They were Catholic in the sense of, Jesus, the poor man that was crucified by the powerful and so on. And in the same moment, I mean, you must remember the shipyards, the name of the shipyards were Lenin shipyards. And you had in the big conference lounge of the shipyard a very big statue of Lenin, and the worker didn't took out this statue. The statue was all the time during the strike, and it was only after the change of the regime in the 90s that the statue was taken out. At the time of the strike, you had the cross, but you had also the Lenin statue.
I would like to add that Poland under the Gierek times was a country who was firstly who built the socialism with the to try to connect the socialism with capitalism. And now we see this in China, but the reform of the Deng Xiaoping, it was the copy, these things which was made by Gierek in the 70s in Poland. So we can say, this is the question, that this protest, the workers are striking not against socialism, but against this reform, capitalist reform, which are made by Gierek.
Yes, the difference with China is that China didn't make loan in Western banks. And the big error of Gierek, he made quite a lot of error, but his big error, I mean, the error of Gierek and his government, was to take money on credit in Western banks, not taking into account the Marx analysis, economical analysis, that capitalism will have crisis, and that when the cyclical crisis will hit capitalism, their first decision will be to export their crisis to foreign countries. And of course, that's what happened with Poland. It means at the beginning of the 70s, there were no crisis in the capitalist world. So when Gierek took the loan, it was under a low interest. But when he had to pay back, at the end of the 70s, it was the crisis, and he had to pay back at a very high interest, and Poland couldn't have a balanced economy at that time. And of course, that when the workers did strike, they striked against this not clever as a socialist state policy of the 70s, which put Poland in a dead end of having to pay loan back without having result from the investment Poland did, because the second idea was that these loans were taken to Poland so to produce new goods that will be exported to the Western countries. But Western countries didn't buy Polish goods at that time, so Poland had no way to pay the loans except taking it from the working class, and then the working class strikes. But of course, this strike was against a semi-pro-capitalist policy of the government. It was not a socialist policy. It was a semi-capitalist policy that was criticized by striking workers, and that's the reason why their main demand was what is called self-management. Since the government and the supposedly working class party made wrong decisions, it's better if workers control the policy, and that's why they ask for a democratization of socialism, so the working class know where the money go. So it's basically, of course, it's completely contradictory with capitalism. Just the problem is that the new working class of Poland that had not the experience of the former pre-war working class, which was aware about class struggle. There was no class struggle, a visible class struggle in Poland during socialism. There was a class struggle, but it was not so visible. So they couldn't imagine that the counselors the worker had, which were professors coming from universities, but to Polish universities, but mostly, like for example, Geremek, a professor who a large part of their life spent in Western countries, collaborating with Western institutions, and progressively being, I would say, corrupt by Western medias, Western elite, Western system, Western ideologies. When they went back to Poland, they were taken by workers to advise them. But of course, they advised in the direction of anti-communism. They didn't tell that. It was during the all 80s, you had no anti-Marxist discourse in the opposition. But in fact, you had a slow deconstruction of Marxist ideas, and openly it happened in the 90s.
I would like to say that Poland, the time of Gierek, was not unique in the world. Yeah. It was the politic of the Western banks and the Western imperialists who, before they are occupied the colonies in Africa and other countries. But after 1960s, when the troops are come back, they decided that now they will control this country in another way. This another way, it is giving a loan, and after wanted that this country pay money, and this country are indebted. They pay all the time, but this credit is all the time bigger and bigger, and this is the thing which the Western countries are control these countries, not using military force but using money.
The first example of what you are saying is Egypt. Egypt was not a purely socialist state under Nasser, but Egypt was a socialist-oriented economy. And imperialism made an experiment in Egypt. At the end, after the death of Nasser, they corrupted part of the dominant class of Egypt, and Egypt went on the side of Western capitalism, on the side of imperialism, and it was a succeeded for capitalist experiment. They used in all other countries of the third world and of the, let's say, socialist second world. And Poland was, I would say, Poland was, I know that Paul wouldn't like what I'm telling, but in a certain extent, Poland was the Eastern Egypt, Eastern European Egypt. I mean, what happened in Egypt happened then in Poland. The corruption of the party nomenclatura, which happened in Egypt. The party in Egypt was the Socialist Arab Union, that was corrupt and transformed in what we have now in Egypt under Sadat and other presidents. We had the same thing in Poland. The corruption of part of the party elite under the pressure of a working class movement, which is advised by Polish intellectuals looking at the Western world like if it was the New Jerusalem, I would say. And it worked. It did work. So on a certain side, there were economical pressure, and on the other side, there was ideological pressure, and there was also the corruption of elite. Elite within the worker party, and of elite in the new Solidarity movement. And in fact, they gave the impression they were fighting each other, but basically at the end, they united in a common front in 1981, and the so-called Round Table Agreement were in fact a class agreement of new bourgeois of the post-communist nomenclatura with new bourgeois of the Solidarity trade union under the supervision of the conservative Catholic Church.
Another question I would like to ask concerns the attitude of the international left, especially the left in imperialist countries, towards Polish solidarity. Isn't it strange, in your opinion, that the same movement was supported by the Polish Pope as well as Margaret Thatcher or Ronald Reagan, and at the same time by trade unions and organizations referring to Marxism, especially Trotsky's? Why did Thatcher, who murdered British miners, support a trade union in Poland?
You know, it's very clear. I mean, we have to come back at the situation at the end of Second World War. At the end of Second World War, the communist movement was very strong. For example, in France, but not only. And in France, we know now that the American CIA corrupted some trade union leaders, trade union from the communist trade union, and later they corrupted some Trotskyist element to create organization of what I call pseudo-left, which were very radical in their discourse. Very radical, telling that Soviet Union is not enough leftist, not enough pro-working class oriented, but their basic strategic aim was that they must get rid of Soviet revisionism, of Soviet communism, of Soviet type socialism. That's the main enemy. And when Soviet Union will collapse, then we will fight American imperialism. And this strategy was, of course, a strategy directed toward masses that could believe that we want a better socialism than the Soviet one. But in reality, it was objectively working on the side of the capitalist imperialist system. And we have, I call that the pseudo-left. A pseudo-left which is sometimes social democrat, sometimes Trotskyist or anarchist or whatever you want to call them. They can change very, very frequently the appearance or the ideological advertising they use. But in fact, they are pseudo-left because they don't accept the real class struggle. And the real class struggle is, of course, the class struggle you have in every country of the world, but it's also the real class struggle between imperialism and anti-imperialism. And of course, we can criticize the Soviet type of socialism, and especially the Polish type of socialism in the 60s or 70s, because of course it was not paradise. And there was a lot of contradictions, and there were a lot of errors that have been made. But you know, when you have the barricade, you have to choose on which side of the barricade you are. And on the barricade, we have no 3 sides or 4 sides. We have always 2 sides. And of course, you have to be on the good side of your class. And in the contradiction between real socialism and real capitalism, you have to choose the real socialism and not the mythical socialism you would like to have if, I don't know, a holy person would would introduce it. And that's the basic case. And that's why the left was divided in Eastern Europe, in Western Europe, in Southern in the Third World, between the, let's say, real left, class left, which was anti-imperialist, and the pseudo-left, the moral left, which was always showing mainly what was going wrong inside socialist movement, but in fact, working for the class enemy.
And Soviet Union don't exist anymore, and this barricade, which you say, also don't exist anymore. But I have impression that for this pseudo left, all the time the biggest enemy, it is not the bourgeoisie of the imperialist countries, but all the time they search for the criticizing Stalin, who is dead. They search the criticizing Soviet Union or the party communist, or they criticize a lot the enemy of the United States. We can find many this.
We have that all the time, and on the internal level and external level. For example, now we have the left, which is very happy with Biden, which is an imperialist dog, which had a lot of human beings, who killed a lot of human beings when he was vice president of the United States. And you have some leftists saying, oh, it's very good, he was elected, he's better than Trump, and so on, but he's a criminal. I don't say Trump is not, but Biden is. And you have the same thing all over the world. The pseudo-left, they concentrate on some enemy, but basically they cannot they don't support a class movement. The pseudo-left is not class-based. The pseudo-left is a group of intellectuals, middle-class people, without any roots with the real existing working class. And that we had in Poland, and that's exactly that. I mean, we had a working class movement, which we can, of course, criticize during the strike of the summer of 1980, but basically it was a working class movement. And then we had all these priests and we had all these intellectuals that went to the workers and became to show them the supposedly much more working class society that can be dreamed, but they worked objectively. Now we know they work objectively to destroy fabrics, to destroy working class. I mean, the Gdańsk shipyard is finished now. What the worker did win, they lose the battle because of this solidarity solidarity movement advisors. And that's always it's much better when we can fight the class enemy, which is visible. The right-wing movement, the openly liberal, ultra-liberal, Thatcher or Reagan, they are very good enemies for us. The problem is not Thatcher and Reagan. The problem is all these social traitors that are supposedly leftists, supposedly even revolutionary, even more revolutionary than the revolutionaries, but that in fact are working for the other side.
It is very funny, this history with Biden, because the pseudo-left, when they criticized Soviet Union or Polish socialists, they said that this was the country which are not democratic. And they all the time they repeat democracy, democracy. Yeah. When we look the last year the election of Biden, first we saw the election in the Democratic Party, yeah. And yeah. We saw that the Biden was the last. It's Sanders who was winning, but after the elite of the Democratic parties, they wanted that all these candidates will go out, and like this, Biden he won this election in the parties. But there are many falsification, many people who are the member of the Democratic Party, they can't vote Sanders, and there are many problems. But after this, we have this history of the elections in USA. And I hate Trump. I don't like Trump. But Trump, when he said that there are many in many states there are the machine who didn't work, who somebody wanted to vote Trump, he voted Biden. That there are many the electoral people who are sending they vote, and in envelope they find all the time the Biden, they don't Trump, and they stop election, but Biden all the time is more and more and more. So we can say in this 100%, I think that election in the USA was falsified. and when this leftists when they ask him, what do you think about the democracy in the USA, which was the last election was falsified? They said, maybe this election was falsified, but the most important that Trump is lost.
Yeah.
So this is the democracy is good, but if something is more important, we don't need democracy. So
we see it even in the United States. Bush was elected with less voices than Al Gore. So it's an old story in the United States. It's not the first time we have something not democratic.
Yes, but it is first time when the falsified is good for the Democrats. Before it was good for the Republicans.
Yeah, and and American imperialism, they support election in the world when those elections are against progressive movements. But when elections, like in Venezuela, in Bolivia, or in Belarus, are in favor of, let's say, more or less left or non-imperialist candidates, then democracy is out of question. And that's the situation we have. So that's why when we had in Poland in the 80s all this discourse about democracy, that led to Gorbachev at the end. Gorbachev was also elected under the theoretical argument of democracy. And this democracy led to the collapse of state, to the massive death of old people in Russia and former Soviet Union, to the massive violence and murder of a Russian member of parliament in 1993, when more than 200, 300 people, and especially members of the parliament, were murdered in Moscow under the applause of Western country, but it was supposedly democratic to murder elected people. Because these elected people were left side, were pro-Soviet, so we had to murder them, even if they were democratically elected. So all this discourse about democracy is pure nonsense. I mean, it is sense, but the sense is to corrupt democracy in the name of democracy. Just that now we are more aware of that. And that's why I wrote this book, because I thought that it's important for Polish people to understand how their society was manipulated against its interest, against what the people wanted. People wanted in Poland more socialism, not less socialism. And we had the same thing in Soviet Union during the Gorbachev time. You had the right-wing opposition, which, of course, they were all telling about that in the Western medias and so on. And you had the working class opposition that was fighting against the decaying of the socialist state. But of course, this left opposition was not propagated in the Western medias, and we see the corruption of the elite and the corruption of the Eastern European elite in every country, almost of Europe. They succeeded to overthrow the regime, and when they couldn't do it in a democratic way, they executed. Why they executed Ceausescu? Because he would have a real process. He would have tell what was happening in this country. So they had to kill him. So he cannot tell what is happening. What happened? It was a military coup. and not a revolution as they were supposedly talking about. But the problem is that so many left people, supposedly left-oriented people, believed, for example, that in 1989 you had a revolution, a democratical revolution of the nation of Eastern Europe. But even if, for example, you look in East Germany, the East German, when they were protesting against the party leadership, they were protesting to create a new socialist Eastern Germany. They were not fighting to become West Germans. And we have that everywhere. I mean, the problem is, the big problem is this pseudo-left, because this pseudo-left gives the impression you are fighting for socialism, and in fact you are fighting not only for capitalism, but for ultra-capitalism, in fact.
So I have another question about pseudo-left. Finally, I would like to ask you to explain what is a color revolution, and can Americans' financing of solidarity be considered as a color revolution? In the long history of the color revolutions, we can mention the strikes of Chilean truck drivers against the Allende government, the strikes of Solidarity, the two-color revolution in Ukraine, the destruction of Libya and Syria, and much more. Did the color revolution improve the situation of working people at least once?
What we call color revolution is relatively recent, because this word is linked with a style of pseudo-revolution that happened since the Milosevic downfall. But this type of color revolution is only the last stage of an evolution that was very, very much earlier done, organized. And solidarity in this case can be described as a prototype of the colored revolution scenarios. Traditionally, I would say, up to the mid-70s, imperialism intervened in different countries, especially, for example, in Chile, through CIA and secret agencies. After at the end of the 70s, the American imperialism was so delegitimized because of its systematic organization of military coup in Latin America, in Asia, in Vietnam, in Indonesia, and so on, that they had to change not their strategy, but they had to change their tactic. How to change progressive country in conservative ones. And then they began to promote NGOs, what we call now NGOs, so supposedly non-governmental organizations. I say supposedly because in fact they are very governmental, but linked with the foreign government and especially with American government. So they are non-governmental with their own government, but they are very governmental with the United States government. And even if, of course, the money that goes in this organization can come from the private sector, because in capitalism, as you know, private sector and government are very linked. So when the Ford Foundation gives money to Solidarity, it looks like if it's not governmental, but it's coordinated with the AFL-CIO, which receives subsidies from the American government or from the American Congress. So the mixture of a government fund and private fund is systematic. And but anyway, the development of what we can call the NGO ideology led to the color revolution, and it began in Poland via, especially via the trade union, U.S. trade union, AFL-CIO, which is. It's obvious. It was recognized, which is very linked with the CIA. And especially one man played a strong role in Poland, Irving Braun, which was a member of the CIA, and in the same time he was the he was working at the foreign department of the IFL-CIO trade union. And IFL-CIO trade union sent to Poland, to the Solidarity movement, a lot of money directly from United States or from let's say, broader countries, like, for example, the Japanese conservative trade union or the French CFDT or FO, the two right-wing or rather right-wing at that time trade unions. And they sent a lot of money to what? To corrupt Solidarność and Solidarity trade union and push them in the direction of the so-called liberal democratic programs. And it's the first stage of a strategy which developed later under the name of colored revolution. Maybe the term of colored revolution was not used because it was rather through trade unions, conservative trade union, that the money was going. Later, it was rather the money was coming through foundation like the Soros Foundation, like NGOs and so on. But the idea that the intervention in different countries cannot be organized directly by the CIA was taken at the end of the 70s. So to a certain extent, we can consider that Solidarity movement was the first succeeded mass experiment of something that led to the color revolution scenario we have in the last 20 years.
Yes, because I think that the most important is to analyze the strategy of the imperialism against revolution. When we saw the intervention, the civil war in Russia, we saw that imperialist countries, they support military the rich who was in the white armies. In the white armies, this was the noble and the bourgeoisie and the people who was privileged before revolution. So they supported the classes, privileged classes, which are not in power now, and this strategy didn't work in Russia, and also in Eastern Europe after the Second World War. We can find in the London many the governments in exile with the monarchy, with the people from Poland who represented the bourgeoisie and the nobles, the great landlords, and these people don't have the popularity in the countries which are making a revolution sociale. And in the 1970s, they changed strategy, and this strategy now they said, we will not find. We'll find somebody like Wałęsa, young worker who are which the other workers can identify.
Yeah, and that's very important because it shows that after the war, the working class movement was so important that it was the working class movement that was leading the world, I will say. So the conservative governments and parties had to use working class argumentations to be believed. And they succeeded in corrupting the working class discourse, take advantage of it, and when they went to power, then they recognized that they were anti-working class. But now, of course, the legitimacy went on the side of the capital and not of the working class. But for the till the end of the 80s, they had no chance to win the heart of the people using right-wing argumentations, using capitalist argumentations, and this shows how the working class was strong. So they had to use working class argumentations, and now, of course, they succeeded in their counter-revolution, because now we have to rebuild the class struggle lines that some of us accepted to give to the working class enemies.
For example, we can find this strategy now against China.
Yeah.
The bourgeoisie media, when they write or speak something about China, they use the words like exploitation. They said that the workers in China are not, their salary is not very good, that they work a lot of hours and they are exploited. But if you listen the Polish Gazeta Wyborcza or media like this, you can think that exploitation and this problem of the low-paying workers is existing, yes, only in China. That this not exist in USA or
there is no exploitation. Of course, Poland is the paradise of workers. So, but it's such a paradise that you have 4 million people that emigrated after 1989. So such a paradise, people leave. So, I mean, things are very clear. I mean, it's obvious that the best tool of bourgeoisie is to use the pro-working class arguments to fight working class. And there is an objective alliance between right-wing movements, conservative movement, and extreme left, pseudo-leftist movements. And we have to be very aware of that, because leftist argumentation, in fact, succeeded. So if you want to win, you must use arguments that will convince working class people that they are on your side. In fact, they're not on your side, but the working class people know they have the right to power. Just that they must understand that they must differentiate their real allies and who is their real enemies. That's the basic question. It's a question of ideological disintegration organized by very well-built propaganda machine of the capitalist.
And we will fight this capitalist propaganda. This is why we try to build the communist media, odrodzenie komunizmu, rebirth of communism, and many other things. So thank you, Comrade Bruno, for our conversation, and we will continue.
Okay, best comradely regards, and okay, so let's work further.
Okay, so, hi.
Bye-bye.